The content of this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. Always consult with a qualified healthcare professional for any health concerns. Take care of yourself out there. Welcome to Unravelling, a podcast that sees the world through the lens of mental health. I'm Kurt White, a social worker and psychotherapist.
And I'm Mary Wilson, a journalist.
And Mary, we're in the midst of our series about investigating how we come to be who we are as people. How do we get from the seed and egg to the personality that we eventually have, and what does the field of mental health have to say about that? And today we're going to talk to someone who's an expert in memory dissociation and childhood trauma.
Yeah, it's a really interesting discussion about how the brain reacts to these really traumatic events in what may seem like a protective way, but in the long term, maybe isn't so much.
That's right. And I think we can learn a lot about how we develop from looking at situations where maybe development went really off the rails a bit, where something that wasn't supposed to happen, something like really significant early childhood abuse, happens to people and really affects the way that their brains develop as a result.
And so we'll really get into why and how people dissociate to sort of deal and cope with some of that trauma.
Yeah, this is an interesting phenomenon of memory where some people, very often related to early psychological trauma, have significant disruption in the way that they experience the world, remember things. Maybe it started as a protective mechanism against an overwhelming experience, but it can become something that goes with them into adult life and interferes with people's day-to-day lives in some small and sometimes very large and debilitating ways.
Yeah, to think of just chunks of your life and of your memory gone is really scary.
It is, and I think it's something that's really misunderstood. I think even by a lot of therapists, it's not something that we necessarily have a ton of training in, and I think it really illustrates the complexity of the way that something like a diagnosis doesn't necessarily capture the full picture of what might be going on in somebody's life. There's a sort of label, but then there's what's underneath the label. It has something to do with our history, our development, our mind's effort to protect itself that maybe went wrong and caused a problem, that now the problem stays with us, as well as the sort of memory of the thing that happened to us. Very complicated stuff.
Yeah, and that's why we wanted to speak to a leader in this field. And we are lucky enough to have a conversation with Dr. J. Douglas Bremner, a researcher, physician, professor, and writer from Atlanta, Georgia. He's a professor of psychiatry and radiology at Emory University School of Medicine, director of the Emory Clinical Neuroscience Research Unit and Mental Health Research at the Atlanta VA Medical Center. Dr. Bremner is a world leader in research in the field of post-traumatic stress disorder and memory, including studies related to false memories. He's served as an expert witness in litigation related to PTSD and drug safety, and has appeared on CNN as an expert analyst. Dr. Bremner has written over 400 research papers and several best-selling books, including Does Stress Damage the Brain?
I can't wait to get into this and to hear this interview with really one of the great figures in the research in this area.
Well, Dr. Bremner, thanks so much for joining me on Unravelling.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to unpacking the fascinating, sometimes controversial intersections of trauma, memory, and dissociation. Can you start by just defining dissociation, what it is, what it looks like, and maybe what it feels like?
Well, dissociation is a specific group of symptoms that we find are highly correlated with one another, although on the surface they may seem to be different. The different categories of dissociative symptoms are derealization, which is things seeming unreal or like you're in a dream, or distortions of perception. Depersonalization is distortions in your own body, which can include feeling like maybe your arms are like toothpicks, or that your body has become very large, or sometimes people will describe looking at themselves from outside of their body. Amnesia is gaps in memory that are not due to normal forgetting, and that's also called dissociative amnesia. And then we have identity alterations, which we think are related to the other symptoms as well, because gaps in memory with amnesia can create sort of the feeling like there's more than two identities that get interrupted by these interruptions in memory.
So it's really a wide spectrum of symptoms here, and it sounds like it's not just spacing out or looking disinterested. What is the difference between that sort of everyday dissociation where we're not paying attention, we've all maybe experienced that, and then these disorders really that require that clinical attention?
Well, like many things in psychiatry, there's a lot of overlap between the clinical definitions and then the way that the terms are used in common conversation. So you say, well, I'm depressed. That's sort of more of just an indication that someone is having some temporary thing that's affecting their mood, but it's not necessarily like a clinical depression. And the same thing with dissociation. What can be like a gap in attention is not the same as a dissociative symptom. They're actually two very different things. And there's been some work on people who have what's called absorption, which is the ability to really become engrossed in a movie or engrossed in a work of art. And that also is sort of a personality characteristic, but it's not the same as dissociation. And so those things are not really correlated with one another. There's two main ways that we see dissociation. One would be in the context of severe psychological trauma. Some of our research studies show that people who dissociate at the time of trauma, this is when we retroactively asked in this study Vietnam veterans about their experiences at the time of combat traumas. And when they retrospectively reported increased dissociative symptoms, they were also more likely to dissociate with regular stressors in daily life. And that dissociation at the time of trauma correlated with psychopathology. So the more you dissociate at the time of trauma, the more long-term PTSD and symptoms and psychological dysfunction you had. One of the main early debates in this field was whether dissociation is protective from trauma. And sort of on the surface of it, you could say like a victim of child abuse may dissociate to protect themselves from the stress or the extreme fear of the abuse. And a lot of people sort of piece things together that way. But the research doesn't actually show that it is protective in terms of long-term psychopathology. So there's a dissociative subtype now in the DSM-5 description of PTSD. And then there are some dissociative symptoms in various versions of acute stress disorder, which is sort of the acute response to trauma that we see in the first month after a trauma. But really, clinically, what happens is that PTSD is sort of the base condition, and it's in the people with the most extreme psychopathology and the most extreme traumas that, in addition, will have dissociative symptoms. So in a study we did back when Shepherd Pratt Hospital in Baltimore had a dissociative identity disorders program, and we looked at those people. All of them had the diagnosis of PTSD. They all had this sort of signature brain changes, which is namely decreased hippocampal volume that we see in PTSD. And, so it was really just seen as an extreme version, of the trauma response. The fact that these symptoms all correlate with one another. So if you look at a so-called subscale of depersonalization and derealization, they correlate so highly with each other that we really can't say that those are separate constructs. There's really just one construct, which is dissociation. And the other arena in which you see dissociation, interestingly, is with ketamine infusion. So normal people will dissociate when they get ketamine. And we've shown that decreases in hippocampal volume correlate with dissociation. And the NMDA receptors are concentrated in the hippocampus. So that really tells us that there's something going on in the hippocampus, which is sensitive to stress.
And that hippocampal volume, is that the actual size of a certain part of the brain? What's happening in the brain?
Yeah, so the hippocampus is a brain area involved in memory. So it's involved in short-term memory and recall. And it's also been shown to be sensitive to stress. In animal studies, there can be a decrease in neuron branching and a decrease in new nerve growth. And it's one of the most replicated findings in psychiatry is that, which we actually reported first years ago, is smaller hippocampal volume. That's been in PTSD that's been replicated over 20 times. And we see it in what I call the trauma spectrum disorder. So women with borderline personality disorder and a history of early trauma will have smaller hippocampal volume, as will patients with DID, dissociative identity disorder.
And you mentioned this dissociation sort of being protective when it comes to psychological trauma, that a child who's being abused will just sort of leave their body to cope with what's happening. What's happening during this? And do you see it as protective? Is it sort of something that is necessary?
Well, the research evidence would tell us that it's not protective, since the people that happens to have worse long-term outcomes than those who it doesn't. Now, one might question, well, maybe they're just the ones that were exposed to the most severe trauma, and that's likely the case. And that this dissociation is just sort of a byproduct of the fact that, they were the most severely traumatized, and it's not the thing that caused the long-term psychopathology. But it does look like the people who dissociate, they may perceive it as having been beneficial at the time, but then the long-term outcome is worse. And so one possibility is that, that's just sort of something that people perceive, and it's not really, based in fact. Or the other is that these are the most severe people, and it may have been helpful at the time, but since they're the most severely traumatized, they're also the ones that are going to have the worst long-term psychopathology. But one thing I would argue is that dissociation with minor stressors is not conducive to normal function. So if you dissociate when you're trying to park your car in a crowded garage, that makes it more difficult to accomplish the task of parking the car. The other thing is that when people dissociate, that they have gaps in memory that they can't account for. That can be very disturbing, because it's not something that they would necessarily share with their friends and family, because a lot of the times their perception is that people will think that I'm crazy, or maybe I'm having a psychotic reaction. And one of the things that we found is that people don't spontaneously report dissociative symptoms, but when you ask them specifically, have you ever felt out of your body? They say, yes, that happened to me. But they don't report it because, they perceive that people may think that it's strange, or there's something wrong with it.
That's interesting. Are there subtle, sort of observable signs of dissociation that you can see in someone? Maybe a therapist who's working with someone can see these things happening in their body?
Well, one of the interesting things is that, we wrote this clinician-administered dissociative state scale, and originally wrote it with the intention of surveying people with trauma histories. And then this was at Yale, I was sort of walking through what we call the challenge room, where we would do these studies where we would give people a drug and see what symptoms they occurred. And they say, oh, that symptom is related to serotonin, or that's related to norepinephrine. And in this case, they were doing ketamine infusions and trying to recreate a model of psychosis. And so I sort of walked through the room, and I saw Yale undergrad students talking about being up on the ceiling. And I said, that's not psychosis, that's dissociation. It's a classic dissociative reaction. And a lot of times people will use ketamine as a recreational drug. They call it Special K. And they'll talk about going out of their bodies and sort of visiting other Special K users up in the universe or whatever. And one of the original version of the scale, we had subjective items and observer items. And the observer items were like, did they seem to be disconnected from what's going on? Did they seem like there were two different alternate personalities that were in play? And those didn't correlate with anything. They were basically useless. So we just dropped those completely. So the research answer is that there isn't really anything you can observe in just looking at a person that tells you that they're dissociating. The best way is to ask for specific, experiences. So of course, like many things in psychiatry, it's just sort of a self-report thing.
Let's talk a bit about memory. Is it safe to say that sort of any type of psychological trauma will mess with your memory, and what alterations are most common?
Well, there's a couple of different aspects of memory that are relevant. So declarative memory would be the ability to remember a list of things that you bought at the grocery store without bringing a written list. And that's tested by, reading a list of words and then having someone repeat the words after 5 minutes. Another type of memory is what we call finding your way memory, which is the ability, for instance, to drive from point A to point B without a map or without a GPS. And that's a hippocampal-based memory. You can do tasks where underwater maze tasks, and you can do video game tasks to test how well people's finding your way memory is. And PTSD patients have problems with that. You also have problems with autobiographical memory, which is likely linked to these other things, which is your ability to basically, tell your life story in a coherent way that comes across like a story, that you can measure that and quantify it. And they have gaps in their ability to tell like a life story. And then there's dissociative amnesia, which is gaps in memory. And that can be, someone could be out for 10 minutes. One of my patients said he went up to pay in the restaurant and they said, well, you've already paid. And it was an embarrassing moment because he had no memory of having paid. And tellingly, he had gotten into an argument with his wife just, 20 minutes earlier. And so he probably dissociated, went up and paid, came back to the table, then had no memory that it occurred. In extreme cases, you'll see people that'll, we had people that would end up in Texas in fatigues in the woods in the middle of the night, or they would leave New Haven. And then the next thing they knew, they were in Boston and they had no memory of how they had gotten there driving. So those can be some of the more extreme versions, but they always correlate with derealization. So when people have amnesia, they'll say, well, they experienced something in a distorted way, and then there was a gap in time, and then that was the next thing that they knew. Then implicit memory would be things like remembering how to ride a bike or how to put a key in a lock. And so those are sort of the two of the main categories of memory. And PTSD patients will have issues with all those.
Wow. So it can really be debilitating for the folks that especially have this severe level.
It can be debilitating. It's sort of like if you drank too much at a party or something, then you had no memory. And then the next day you're like, what happened? But then that happens to them all. I mean, most people are hopefully not doing that enough to, maybe you had it happen to you once in your life or something, but those sort of experiences are happening to them, like on a daily basis, which is very disconcerting.
Yeah. What's the aftermath of that like when someone realizes that, I did something I have no memory of, or I don't know where the last 2 hours went? How do they work through that on the other side?
Well, as you can imagine, people will try and compensate, and, that will usually entail, if you have gaps in memory like that and someone said, well, I saw you at the store yesterday or something, they're not going to say, well, I had a gap of dissociative amnesia, probably. They try and compensate by covering it up.
Are there things that are triggering these episodes, or can they just happen out of the blue?
Well, there's usually something that triggers it. So it may be a minor stressor, like trying to find a parking space. It may be a traumatic reminder. So a lot of veterans from Iraq will see a bag of garbage on the side of the road, which reminds them of how the insurgents used to put these explosive devices in garbage. And so that'll trigger them, so things like anything that's like a traumatic reminder or a stressor can trigger the response.
Mm. And you mentioned the overlap with PTSD, borderline personality disorder. How do you sort of distinguish between dissociative symptoms from symptoms of other disorders?
So, flashbacks, which is sort of the classic flashbacks, I often talk about the movie Born on the 4th of July, which is kind of dated now, and that it was with Tom Cruise. He was about a Vietnam veteran. And then he comes back from the war and he's sort of like he's in a bar and something triggers him. And then he sees himself in this combat action where, they're coming over the dunes in Vietnam and they're engaging the Viet Cong. And he's seeing it play like a movie right in front of his eyes. And so that's like a classic flashback. And flashbacks are, again, we get into this territory where people say, I had a flashback to when I went to Miami, but those are not real flashbacks. Flashbacks are things where people will re-see a traumatic event and it plays like a movie in their mind and it'll just sort of take over their complete consciousness. And that is a symptom of PTSD. So we have one symptom that is a clear dissociative phenomenon, although the way it's written now, it says, re-experiencing as if you were back there. So it can kind of loosely cover things where you feel like something's happening that was like your combat experience, but you're not actually experiencing it in a dissociative way. Gaps of memory at the time of the traumatic event occurred has long been one of the symptoms of PTSD, and that is dissociative amnesia right there. And then there's the dissociative subtype that's sort of at the end of the DSM-5 criteria that's not required for the diagnosis. And then in borderline personality disorder, a lot of them will have dissociative symptoms, but there's not really any symptoms that are clearly dissociative in the criteria. So what we have is we have these clear criteria that you don't need to have dissociation to meet criteria for. And then there's the criteria for the dissociative disorders themselves. We actually did a survey of a hospital in Holland to see how often dissociative amnesia was diagnosed. And the answer was basically never. And part of the reason is that a lot of clinicians are not really educated about what the symptoms are. And they're the kind of symptoms that you don't learn about unless you specifically ask people. So people come in and say, I've been having depression. I've been, lost interest in things I used to like to do. They won't come in and say, I'm having gaps in memory that I can't explain by normal forgetting. And there's a number of reasons for that. Because they're not aware of what it is. Maybe they find it frightening. They think people may think they're crazy, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm. Would you call dissociation sort of a natural phenomenon of normal brain function? I'm thinking of, kids who are daydreaming, looking outside during class and, envisioning that they want to be in a different place. We sort of mentioned like that spacing out. Or would there be an explanation for that type of zoning out that relates to some sort of trauma? And are they mutually exclusive?
Well, again, I think that the absorption of experience or daydreaming, absorption could be seen as sort of something seen in highly creative or artistic people, for instance. They could become so absorbed in a film that they feel like it's happening to them, or they'll cry, or they'll have more of an emotional reaction. Again, that's not synonymous with dissociation. Another kind of confusion of terms is that people will say dissociation, which when they start saying disassociation, they're talking about like separating yourself from something mentally, which is not at all dissociation. Dissociation it's not something that you can easily control yourself. Whereas you can have someone daydreaming and then you say, come out of the daydream, and they will. But if someone's like in a full-blown flashback, talking to them out of it doesn't work usually. You don't really see people who are having true dissociation who don't have severe psychopathology. Here in Georgia, that Herschel Walker is the football player who ran for Senate, who claimed that he'd been diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder. But my response to that is I've never interviewed him. I can't diagnose him or not, but I've never seen anyone with DID who is functioning as well as he is, and I think that was probably a misdiagnosis, or, he got some incorrect information. BPD and PTSD are distinct disorders, and it's kind of interesting. The way I look at it is there's you can have early childhood trauma, and then one pathway is PTSD and one pathway is borderline personality disorder. When the studies that we did where we would create a traumatic script and then look at physiologic response like heart rate and blood pressure, women with PTSD would respond to the trauma script, and then we had another script we called it an abandonment script, where it's an artificial scenario where we say, you went to the mall with your mom, she left you there, you were abandoned in the mall. And BPD women will react to that, but not the trauma script, even if they have the trauma history. So there's a kind of a unique profile where they're reacting to these abandonment situations. Some of them will have comorbid PTSD, but there's many people who will have a trauma history and develop BPD as the primary diagnosis. And their reactivity is to the abandonment scenario. And a lot of times those episodes of abandonment, panic, if you will, in the severe cases, they'll have dissociative symptoms in addition to that. So I sort of see dissociative symptoms as being, associated with severe psychological trauma.
I know you've researched some controversial topics too, including this false memory syndrome, which is sort of a claim that came about that therapists were creating false memories of child abuse. What did you learn about this?
Well, that was a trend that came and went. Just studying the phenomena itself is pretty interesting. Like, where did this come from? Why did it go away? Part of the history is related to litigation and people who were litigation related to childhood trauma and claims of childhood trauma that, led to court cases, civil litigation, et cetera. And there's a group of psychologists who were studying memory who were not in the trauma field, who were just studying memory for the purposes of scientific interests. And sort of the finding is, to make a long story short, that they were able to show that memory is not as infallible as people might think it is. And it's subject to insertions and deletions and modifications. And so that science got brought into the courtroom in the defense of people who were accused of childhood abuse by people who said that they had a delayed recall of a traumatic experience. So my kind of takeaway from all that is that there probably were some therapists who were overzealously believing that all psychopathology is related to childhood trauma, and that there were probably some situations where they were suggesting events that did not occur. And we know that that is possible because of this research literature showing that you can suggest things to people that they will, later feel like it really happened to them. So the example would be, where were you when the spaceship Challenger Discovery exploded on the launch pad? And well, I was in school, but then someone says, well, weren't you over at your Aunt Mary's? And then later you have what we call a gap in source memory, where you think, I was at Aunt Mary's, but you don't realize that someone else told you that and it wasn't your actual own memory. And it can get to be so extreme that it feels like real, like it was a real memory. And so there's that phenomenon. And then there's the sort of the whole cottage industry that grew up around the false memory syndrome, which included a lot of people who probably were actually child predators, in my opinion. And so it became so difficult to sort of sort out all these different threads that it became a fairly murky area, and then it just sort of dropped off the radar. But the fact is that people can repress memories, if you will. And, we all know that there's difficult things that have happened that we don't think about every day. And then something can come along to trigger the memory of it. And you say, oh, I hadn't thought about that in a long time, but it was an actual significant event that was associated with distress. And I wrote a paper back then about, kind of explaining neural mechanisms by which you could have delayed recall for memory. And part of that involves sort of the breakdown of sort of normal declarative memory and autobiographical memory that we see in PTSD patients. So that can mean that, something that a traumatic event could sort of become severed off of your autobiographical tree, if you will, and then a strange circumstance may make it sort of pop back into consciousness. But a lot of this stuff is just sort of things that in the end we may never really be able to know the answer to. But one of the things that came out of that is there's a lot more informed consent about therapy, and that, was a result of a lot of the litigation that occurred related to that.
I've definitely experienced that feeling of like, is this a true memory, or is it something my mom told me, or did I see a picture of myself as a child doing this and I don't actually remember it? What does the science say about the reliability of traumatic memories resurfacing after these long periods?
Well, one kind of classical experiment was they had a group of college students, and they say, well, when you were 5 years old, you went to this wedding and you knocked over the punch bowl. And it was something that was just fabricated. And they would bring back people once a month to interview them about this. And by the end of a year, they're like, yeah, I remember the punch bowl, and my uncle Bob, he got mad at me, but then afterward, my mom said it was okay. And they would sort of like confabulate these memories. And then in your mind, they become like a real memory. And then we did a study with something I do as sort of a parlor trick with lectures sometimes, is something called the DEIS paradigm, which is you read a list of words that are all kind of associated with each other. And then there's what the critical lure, maybe needle. So then you say thread, tailor, pain, and then there may be unrelated words like horse, house, whatever. And then so you read this list of words and you say, I'm going to ask you to remember them. And then you go back and you do recall, did you see the word thread, tailor? And then did you see the word needle? And 80% of the people will raise their hand, even though it was not on the list, because it's associated with the other words. So that's sort of a little parlor trick you can do to show that people can falsely remember things. And when we did that with women with PTSD, they would do that more than the normal people would. And then their ability to recall words that they'd actually had seen was also worse. And so what that tells me is that, when you have fragmentation of memory, it could be that you're more susceptible to those sorts of false memories, if you will. But that doesn't mean that all memories of trauma are false, or that even delayed recall memories are false. It just means that they may be more susceptible to that sort of thing.
What does healing look like? I mean, do you need to be able to recover some of these memories in order to fully heal? What is the path forward for someone dealing with dissociative symptoms?
I think, most therapists would say that the role of therapy is reintegration, so if there are traumatic memories that are sealed off in consciousness, if you will, or not, part of the normal daily thoughts, then it may be that, and those will be painful memories, and they may be things that a therapist would have to, moderate their anxiety as they recall these traumatic memories. And, there's cognitive behavioral therapy techniques that can help people to reduce anxiety and whatnot. And so that would be the goal of long-term psychotherapy, would be to reduce the anxiety associated with specific memories and sort of maybe cognitively help people reintegrate and have a better perspective as an adult on certain pathways of thought that children may have, that, blaming themselves or, et cetera, that if they can cognitively restructure it, may be able to, reintegrate those memories into the main core of themselves and come up with a new narrative that can incorporate those past traumas, but, also help someone kind of move forward and heal. Kind of on a brain basis, that's probably like a frontal cortex kind of thing, where your frontal cortex is taking more control from the more primitive fear-related areas like amygdala, for instance.
Mm. And is ketamine something that you see being used to trigger dissociation and sort of help someone maybe dive into a problem and face it?
Well, that's interesting. So I was involved in the initial study of ketamine just because I was, I had written the questionnaire that seemed to capture the phenomenon the best. And then after I left Yale, some of the other people that I've been working with started trying it out as a treatment of depression and finding that it worked. And to me, that was counterintuitive, because it was something that was inducing what I would consider pathological reaction, but then it had therapeutic effects. I think probably the most likely explanation is that this dissociative reaction is just sort of a byproduct of the drug, and the drug is having a primary effect on depressive symptoms, but it's not because it's inducing dissociation. That's just sort of, and in fact, Janssen, which did the trials, considered it as a side effect. And I think there has been some studies of PTSD with ketamine. We tried to look at, is there a correlation between the degree of dissociation and the therapeutic response? I think the answer is probably not, and so, and the same would go for PTSD. I don't think that ketamine is inducing someone to go back into a traumatic memory and re-experiencing it in a state of decreased arousal. It's just, sort of creating outer body experiences. And my guess is it's probably not making people dissociate within a traumatic memory. It's just what we know from the depression trials is that, they're just having dissociative reactions, like feeling out of their body or feeling like there's gaps in their memory. They're not reliving events from the past. Not as much has been done with PTSD, so those are some of the interesting questions that people can look at. My guess would be that the answer would be that it's not a therapeutic effect through dissociation. It's something else.
What do you see happening in the future for this field of research when it comes to dissociation? What left is there to uncover and learn about, especially with the intersection of trauma and memory?
In the field of dissociation, I think probably the most important thing would really be to enhance clinician awareness. I think that the gap is in clinician awareness of what the symptoms are and the lack of identification of people with the disorder. If nothing else, it would be important, just sort of a psychoeducational perspective, to allow people to learn more about their symptoms and to take more control. I'm always an advocate for kind of consumer advocacy in the health field in general, and mental health in particular. That the more you can kind of advocate people to learn more about their disorder and to take charge of their own recovery, the better.
Do you think there are people experiencing dissociation who don't know how to maybe tell their therapists, or it's just going unrecognized?
I think the default is that people who are large number, maybe like 1% of the population, based on some estimates, that are experiencing trauma-related dissociative symptoms that are not telling their therapist. Because I know that if I have patients who are I'm finding out that I've known for a while, and I'm finding out later that they are having these symptoms, and I'm the one who literally wrote the scale to measure the symptoms, then that's a good indicator that probably most therapists out there who are not aware of what's going on. And when I give lectures to like trainees, psychiatry residents, and nurse practitioners and psychology interns, there's something that they're not aware of, this part of the core training.
And you mentioned too, just mixing up that term and, pronouncing it wrong, disassociation. It sort of shows that there's this lack of education. And I think for a lot of us, our context for dissociative disorder is villains in movies, TV, the psychological thrillers where these characters are switching personalities or suppressing something. How can we make this better represented in the media for people who experience it?
I think there could be, yeah, you're right. So, you have the classic Hitchcock movie where someone sort of has a repressed personality that comes out, or there's some major traumatic event that it could be like a glamorous movie star who suddenly has a memory pop out. And another interesting thing is some of these disorders can kind of come and go, so hysteria is a disorder that was very common in the 19th century that seems to have disappeared. And I see it as that there's sort of a core of psychopathology, and then culture can kind of come on top of it and modify how it's manifest. So one disorder that disappeared was fugue state, which is a dissociative disorder. It's kind of like an extreme version of psychogenic amnesia or dissociative amnesia, where someone will completely forget who they are and then go on and live a whole different life. And people would report that maybe 100 years ago, but we don't really see that as much anymore. And part of it maybe is just the education or whatnot. And then you have the Hitchcock phenomenon of the repressed personality, or the, sort of extreme versions of dissociative identity disorder. Whereas I think it would be more helpful to sort of convey, maybe in a documentary or something, what the true nature of these symptoms are, and how, 90% of the people are experiencing not these extreme episodes of a personality being suppressed, but these little things in minor daily life, like feeling like you're in a dream, or seeing things outside of your body, or feeling like things you're looking through a telescope on the wrong end, stuff like that occurs. And I think if there's more awareness of it in the general public, really, that would help patients who are experiencing these things to self-identify, and for the clinicians to sort of, learn more about what's going on in their patients. And, in the extreme versions of identity alterations, the therapeutic goal is to help to reintegrate them. And so that would require kind of having the knowledge of the different altered personalities. But for the bulk of the population that are experiencing these other symptoms like amnesia, et cetera, I think just kind of psychoeducation can help decrease some of the stigmatization, or some of the tendency to not self-report that we see now.
How can therapists create a safe space for clients dealing with dissociative symptoms, especially if those symptoms involve fragmented memory or identity confusion?
I think the first step is really to just educate people about, what the symptoms are. And so initially the clinicians, would need to educate themselves. But, I'll just take our scale for dissociation. I'll just give it to patients and ask them to fill it out. That's sort of a good first step. And you can, just go onto the DSM-5 and create a list of all this, the symptoms that are in the DSM-5 and also in the description of the DSM-5, which gives examples of some of the ways that these symptoms can manifest. And then just, go through the list with your patients and ask, if they have experienced any of them. That's like very specific. If you have had it, then you'll right away recognize it.
And that must be such a moment of validation when the patient is hearing the therapist ask that question and it resonates with them.
Yeah, I think that can, I've found that it facilitates the, like the connection with patients, to be able to, have your clinician understand, what you're experiencing can be very, reaffirming.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bremner, so much for being on the podcast. This was a really interesting conversation.
Oh, thank you.
And our thanks again to Dr. Bremner for leading us through this very complex topic. And joining me again is Kurt. Kurt, what did you think?
Oh, so wonderful to hear his insights in this way. Well, it's a topic I think a lot about as a psychotherapist, because I've worked with a lot of folks with pretty severe psychological trauma. And it's really interesting to hear one of the folks that really has been investigating this for decades and his insights, because it blends so perfectly with my experience as a psychotherapist. It's such a terrible problem, I think, for people with significant early childhood trauma, and is very often associated with some level of dissociative symptoms later on in life that sometimes are not really diagnosed, actually.
Is it difficult as a therapist to even diagnose this in the first place?
I think it can, especially if you're not necessarily looking directly for it, which is a point that he makes very well. Because in a way, it's an absence of a thing, isn't it? It's like if your therapy client doesn't remember at all the last session that you had, would you necessarily know it? They might not come in and announce that. Or if they don't remember that they, had a difficult interaction with the person at the front desk or something, and then you try to mention it to them, they don't remember it, actually. Like, you wouldn't necessarily know it, except maybe from the discrepancy. So I think you have to watch very carefully for things like that. And then I think even more complicated are these folks with maybe large segments of their life having a kind of dissociative amnesia about it. People might say, sometimes they know, right? One person has said to me, like, I don't remember anything from this particular year. I'm like, oh my goodness. But then others, it's kind of like, if you ask them about their life, you can kind of see they can't quite put a timeline on it. And that's when I start to think maybe something is amiss here. Maybe something is sort of behind a curtain, as it were, of dissociative amnesia, usually something quite traumatic.
And maybe initially you would think, oh, it's kind of nice. They can't remember something terrible that happened to them. But really, this can cause some greater issues down the road.
It's true. Very often we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, the disorder most associated with trauma in a way, right? That's the one people think of. You've got trauma, you've got post-traumatic stress, as a disorder of not being able to forget things in a way, right? You have re-experiencing symptoms. You get flashbacks of memory, right? It's a disorder of memory in that way. But actually that kind of thing is a signal that things are not remembered in the usual way, right? They're remembered in this kind of way where they come back to you and overwhelm, right? As Dr. Bremner says, that can be like you're watching a film of something in your life happening in a traumatic way, right? That's not actually how we're supposed to remember things. So it's a not being able to forget. But sometimes it also is true that people can't remember things because they're dissociated, they're behind a certain wall, but they're still sort of suffering from the dissociative symptom that comes up, which is sort of as he alludes to, this sort of complicated therapeutic work of integration.
Wow. Well, Dr. Bremner has just done a ton of work on this topic. He's written a lot of really interesting books as well. And you can find more information at dougbremner.com. And we'll put that link in the show notes.
Yeah, and I hope people continue to join us on our journey through this series of trying to understand how do we get to be who we are, and who are we anyway.
Much more to come, and we'll see you next time on Unravelling.
Unravelling is brought to you by Brattleboro Retreat. Our producers at Charts and Leisure are Andrew Adkin, Hans Buetow, and Jason Oberholzer.
And you can find us on social media by searching Brattleboro Retreat. Brattleboro Retreat is committed to exploring diverse perspectives on mental health. While we invite hosts and guests to share their insights, the views expressed are their own and do not necessarily reflect the policies or positions of the hospital or its staff.